All right, let's break down what's next for these two bantamweights after they just competed for a minute and 50 seconds because Kai Asakura got his first UFC victory against Cameron Smotherman, leaving him in the dust in his wake of his first UFC win. Congratulations to him in his bantamweight debut in the UFC, mind you. So now, what is next for the former Ryzen bantamweight champion? Well, let's make it easy for us, shall we? Well, also let's remind you that he's coming off of back-to-back losses to Tim Elliott and the former UFC flyweight champion of the world, Alexandre Pantoja. So what's next for him? It's an easy pick, ladies and gentlemen. Ricky Simone. Why do I think Ricky Simone is an easy pick if he's going to stay in the bantamweight division? It's because Ricky Simone's last victory was against Cameron Smotherman himself at the UFC Fight Night in Atlanta last June. So Ricky Simone is off of a win off of Cameron Smotherman, but that's not his most recent victory. That's the most recent victory we see there for Kai Asakura, but let's see what's the recent trend for Ricky lately. He had a draw earlier this year at UFC 327 or no, at the UFC Fight Night right before 327 against Adrian Yanez. Lost a unanimous decision to number 14 ranked bantamweight in the world currently, Hani Barcelos. And then he beat, obviously, Cameron Smotherman. So if you give Ricky Simone this option to fight Kai Asakura after he fought Adrian Yanez and Ronnie Barcelos, that name Kai Asakura fits with those two fighters more than it fits with a fighter like Cameron Smotherman. And obviously, with him getting mounted guillotine choked by Tim Elliott and then rear naked choked unconscious by Alexandre Pantoja, it's a fight that makes sense for Ricky because if you remember back in 2022, he fought back when they were ranked bantamweights at the time, number 14 in the world, Jack Shore, and mounted arm triangle choked him, which he is the jiu-jitsu guy, and Jack Shore, that was his specialty. So that's why I think that fight makes sense. But if it doesn't, yeah, that's my primary choice. Here's my secondary, the former UFC flyweight champion in the world who was coming off of his fourth loss of his last five fights this past Saturday that he competed in the main event last morning, I should say. And the reason I think that it makes sense, I already said in my video before, he's the former UFC flyweight champion. Kai is the former UFC flyweight champion. Kai is the former Ryzen bantamweight champion. And now that he's finally in the bantamweight division after his first UFC win, it makes sense. And they both competed at the same event with Deiveson Figueiredo losing to Song Yadong and Kai Asakura beating Cameron Smotherman. So speaking of Cameron Smotherman, he is on the three-fight skid, losing to Kai Asakura, Ricky Simone, and Surrey City. So why do I think it makes sense for Ricky Simone to still compete in the UFC? Because there's still some options out there for him. So let's see which ones do I think make sense. Malcolm the Machine Wellmaker, who, let's be honest, just like I mentioned with Cameron Smotherman, Malcolm is coming off of a skid himself in a two-fight back-to-back losing streak to Ethan Ewing, the Professor Finesser, and a few weeks ago to the debuting Juan Diaz with the former flyweight champion Brandon Moreno in his corner. I think that makes sense too if you think Cameron Smotherman's losing skid compared to Malcolm Wellmaker's losing skid. Whoever loses that fight, think you got to go back to the regionals and earn your way back to the UFC. If that fight doesn't come to fruition, though, that's my primary choice. My secondary would be the former or the UFC Ultimate Fighter Season 29 winner, Ricky Turcios, who I mentioned with Malcolm Wellmaker, he had a skid, but if you want to go three-fight skid for three-fight skid, Ricky Turcios is coming off of back-to-back-to-back losses to, well, first, this fight to me makes sense. I want to bring this back up to attention that Cameron Smotherman and Ricky Turcios were supposed to fight at the first card of the year in the debut event for the Paramount streaming era at UFC 324, and Smotherman had to pull out because he fainted at the weigh-ins. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if you forgot, Cameron Smotherman was at the weigh-ins at UFC 324, and then he walked off the scale and face planted in front of literally everyone in the world to see when it was being recorded. And so he recovered from that and got back to his feet, made weight for this fight. Congratulations. And got slept in a minute and 50 seconds. So that's the reason why I think Ricky Turcios deserves to get this fight back because he fought on his three-fight losing skid Raul Rosas Jr., who's the number 13th ranked bantamweight in the world now. Bernardo Sopaj, who got him, in a decision, but that's is what it is. and then also lost earlier this year at UFC 326 to Alberto Montaz by or Darce choke. So he's on a three-fight skid. Cameron Smotherman's on his three-fight skid, losing to, remember, Surrey City, Ricky Simone, and Kai Asakura. So both of these men, just like I mentioned, with my primary choice with Malcolm Wellmaker. Whoever loses that fight potentially, they're going to be cut just the same.